The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of Arizona Territory in 1885. Jack Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his horse along the familiar trail that led to his ranch. The land here was harsh and unforgiving, but it was home. He had built his life on these acres, raising cattle and trying to make an honest living in a place where survival meant everything. Jack was not like other ranchers in the territory. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, his imposing frame earned him the nickname Apache Tall among the local Native American tribes. But the name carried more than just reference to his height. Jack had learned the Apache language during his early years in the territory, and he understood their ways better than most white settlers. This understanding had kept him alive. When others had fallen to the ongoing conflicts between settlers and the Apache people, the ranch itself sat in a valley surrounded by red rock formations that seemed to touch the sky. Jack had chosen this location carefully. It offered protection from the harsh desert winds and provided access to a reliable water source. The Apache had used this same valley for generations before the white settlers arrived. Jack knew this and he respected it. Unlike many of his neighbors, he had never tried to drive the Apache away from their traditional hunting grounds that bordered his property. As Jack approached his ranch house, he noticed something unusual. Smoke was rising from his chimney, but his wife Sarah and their 2 children had traveled to town 3 days earlier to visit her sister. The smoke meant someone was inside his home. In this territory, that could mean trouble. Jack dismounted his horse quietly and approached the house with caution, his rifle ready. The front door of the ranch house stood slightly open. Jack could hear voices inside speaking in low tones. He recognized the language immediately. Apache. His knowledge of their tongue allowed him to understand what they were saying. There were at least 3 men inside, and they were talking about food and water. They sounded tired and desperate. Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of confronting the intruders with force, he called out in Apache, announcing his presence and asking to speak with them peacefully. The voices inside the house went silent. After a long moment, an older Apache man appeared in the doorway. His face was weathered by years of sun and hardship, and his eyes held a mixture of wariness and dignity. The man introduced himself as Naiche, and Jack immediately understood the significance of this meeting. Naiche was the son of Cochise, the legendary Apache leader. He was also one of the most wanted men in the territory, with a substantial bounty on his head. The U.S. Army had been hunting him for months, along with the famous warrior Geronimo. Naiche explained their situation in his native tongue. He and 2 other warriors had been separated from their band during a recent encounter with soldiers. They had been traveling for days without food or water, and they had taken shelter in Jack's house only because they were desperate. They had not intended to steal anything, and they were prepared to leave immediately. Jack studied the 3 men carefully. They were indeed in poor condition. Their clothes were torn, and they showed clear signs of exhaustion and hunger. One of the younger warriors appeared to be injured, with a makeshift bandage around his arm that was stained with dried blood. These were not raiders or thieves. They were survivors trying to make their way back to their people. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jack himself. Instead of ordering them to leave or threatening to turn them in for the reward money, Jack invited them to stay. He told them in Apache that they could rest, eat, and tend to their wounds. The only condition was that they must be gone before his family returned from town. Naiche stared at Jack for a long time, trying to understand this white rancher who spoke their language and offered help instead of violence. In all his years of conflict with white settlers, he had never encountered such a gesture. Most whites saw Apache people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed, or enemies to be destroyed. Over the next several hours, Jack provided the 3 Apache men with food, water, and medical supplies for the injured warrior. He also shared information about Army patrol routes in the area, helping them plan a safer path to rejoin their band. During this time, Jack and Naiche talked extensively about the ongoing conflict between their peoples. Naiche spoke of the impossible situation facing the Apache tribes. The U.S. government wanted to force all Apache people onto reservations, far from their ancestral lands. Many Apache leaders believed that fighting was the only way to preserve their way of life and protect their children's future. Others argued that continued resistance would only lead to complete destruction of their people. Jack shared his own perspective on the situation. He had seen good and bad people on both sides of the conflict. He believed that understanding and respect between different peoples was possible, but it required individuals willing to take risks and make difficult choices. He told Nietzsche that he had chosen to help them, not because he supported all Apache actions, but because he believed in treating all people with basic human dignity. As evening approached, Nietzsche and his companions prepared to leave. Before departing, Nietzsche made Jack an offer that would bind their fates together. He told Jack that he was now considered a friend of the Apache people, and that this friendship came with both benefits and dangers. If Jack ever needed help, he could call upon the Apache for assistance. But he also warned that this association could make Jack enemies among his own people. Jack accepted this friendship, knowing full well what it might cost him. As he watched the three Apache warriors disappear into the gathering darkness, he felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. He had followed his conscience and helped fellow human beings in need. But he also understood that his actions had set in motion events that could change everything about his life in the territory. The next morning brought news that would test Jack's new alliance, sooner than anyone expected. A neighbor arrived at the ranch with word that a group of Apache warriors had raided a settlement 20 miles to the south. 3 settlers had been killed, and the territorial governor was organizing a massive manhunt to track down the responsible parties. The neighbor also mentioned that there were rumors of Apache sympathizers in the area, and that anyone caught helping the enemy would face serious consequences. Jack listened to this news with growing concern, knowing that his decision to help Nietzsche and his warriors had made him exactly the kind of person the authorities would be looking for. 3 weeks passed since Jack's encounter with Nietzsche and his warriors. Life at the ranch had returned to its normal rhythm, but Jack remained alert for any signs of trouble. His wife Sarah and their children Emma and Thomas had returned from town with stories of increasing tensions between settlers and Apache tribes throughout the territory. Sarah noticed that Jack seemed more distant and watchful than usual, but she attributed it to the general atmosphere of fear that had settled over their community. The first test of Jack's new alliance came on a scorching afternoon in late summer. Jack was repairing fence posts in the far pasture when he spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east. As the riders drew closer, he recognized the uniforms of territorial militia. There were 6 men led by Captain William Hayes, a man known throughout the region for his aggressive tactics against Apache tribes. Captain Hayes dismounted and approached Jack with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating civilians. He was a compact man with cold blue eyes and a mustache that failed to soften his harsh features. Hayes had built his reputation on successful raids against Apache camps, and he took pride in the fact that he had never lost a man under his command. The captain wasted no time with pleasantries. He informed Jack that they were conducting a search of all properties in the area for signs of Apache activity. There had been reports of white settlers providing aid to hostile Indians, and Hayes intended to investigate every ranch and farm in the valley. He demanded to search Jack's property immediately. Jack maintained his composure despite the growing tension in his chest. He knew that any evidence of his assistance to Nietzsche and his warriors had been carefully removed, but Hayes was known for his thoroughness and his willingness to interpret innocent circumstances as evidence of guilt. Jack granted permission for the search, knowing that refusing would only create more suspicion. The militia spent 2 hours going through every building on the ranch. They searched the main house, the barn, the storage sheds, and even the root cellar where Sarah kept her preserved foods. Hayes himself examined Jack's personal belongings, looking for anything that might connect him to Apache activities. The captain paid particular attention to Jack's books, noting that several volumes dealt with Indian customs and languages. During the search, Hayes questioned Jack extensively about his knowledge of Apache language and customs. Jack explained that he had learned the language as a matter of practical survival in the territory. Many successful ranchers and traders had found it useful to communicate with the various tribes that moved through the region. Hayes seemed skeptical of this explanation, but he could find no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. As the militia prepared to leave, Hayes delivered a warning that chilled Jack to the bone. The captain said that anyone found providing assistance to hostile Indians would be charged with treason against the territorial government. The penalty for such crimes could include imprisonment, loss of property, and even death. Hayes made it clear that he would be watching Jack's activities closely in the coming weeks. After the militia departed, Jack realized how precarious his situation had become. His decision to help Nietzsche had been motivated by basic human compassion, but the political climate in the territory made such actions extremely dangerous. He began to understand that his friendship with the Apache people had placed his entire family at risk. That evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of red and gold, he heard a familiar sound. It was the call of a desert hawk, but Jack recognized it as something else entirely. It was an Apache signal, one that Nietzsche had taught him during their brief time together. Someone was trying to contact him. Jack followed the sound to a rocky outcropping about half a mile from his house. There, hidden among the boulders, he found a young Apache woman he had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 20s with intelligent dark eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to difficult situations. She introduced herself as Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in Apache. Ayana carried an urgent message from Nietzsche. Apache scouts had observed the militia's search of Jack's ranch, and they were concerned for his safety. More importantly, Nietzsche needed Jack's help with a matter of life and death. A group of Apache children and elderly tribal members had become separated from the main band during a recent army attack. They were hiding in a canyon about 10 miles from Jack's ranch, but they were running out of food and water. The request placed Jack in an impossible situation. Helping the Apache refugees would require him to make multiple trips to deliver supplies, greatly increasing his risk of discovery. If Captain Hayes or his men caught him providing aid to Apache people, it would mean certain imprisonment and the destruction of his family's livelihood. But refusing to help would mean watching innocent children and elderly people suffer and possibly die. Ayana sensed Jack's internal struggle and shared additional information that made the decision even more difficult. Among the refugees was an elderly Apache medicine man named Delche, who possessed knowledge of sacred sites throughout the territory. The U.S. Army was particularly interested in capturing Delche because they believed he could lead them to hidden Apache strongholds. More importantly for Jack, Ayana revealed that Delche had prophetic visions about the future of the conflict between white settlers and Apache tribes. According to these visions, there would come a time when a white man and an Apache would stand together to prevent a great tragedy that would cost many lives on both sides. Nietzsche believed that Jack might be the white man from Delche's prophecy. Jack listened to this revelation with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. He was not a particularly religious or superstitious man, but he had lived in the territory long enough to respect the spiritual beliefs of the Apache people. Whether or not he believed in prophecies, he could not ignore the immediate need of the refugees. After much consideration, Jack agreed to help. However, he insisted on certain conditions to protect both his family and the Apache refugees. All supply deliveries would take place at night, and Jack would use hidden trails that he had discovered during his years of ranching in the area. Ayana would serve as the liaison between Jack and the refugees, ensuring that there was no direct contact that might be observed by Army scouts. Over the next week, Jack made 4 dangerous nighttime journeys to deliver food, water, and medical supplies to the hidden Apache refugees. Each trip required him to travel through terrain that was regularly patrolled by both Army units and territorial militia. He had to time his movements carefully to avoid detection, using his knowledge of local patrol schedules and safe routes. During these supply runs, Jack began to understand the true scope of the tragedy unfolding in the territory. The Apache refugees included children as young as 5 years old and elderly people in their 70s. Many of them were sick or injured from their ordeal, and all of them lived in constant fear of discovery by hostile forces. Despite their desperate circumstances, they maintained their dignity and cultural traditions. On his 4th trip to the refugee camp, Jack finally met Delche, the elderly medicine man whose capture was so important to the Army. Delche was a frail man in his 80s, but his eyes held a wisdom and strength that impressed Jack immediately. Through Ayana's translation, Delche shared his vision of the coming crisis and Jack's role in preventing it. According to the medicine man's prophecy, a great battle was approaching that would determine the future of both Apache and white communities in the territory. The outcome of this battle would depend on whether representatives of both peoples could find a way to work together, despite generations of mistrust and violence. Delche believed that Jack's willingness to risk everything to help Apache refugees proved that he was the white man destined to play a crucial role in this coming confrontation. The prophecy weighed heavily on Jack's mind as he returned from his meeting with Delche. The old medicine man's words had been delivered with such conviction that even Jack's practical nature could not dismiss them entirely. But prophecies and visions seemed far less important than the immediate crisis developing around his ranch and family. 2 days after Jack's encounter with Delche, his worst fears began to materialize. Sarah noticed unusual activity around their property during daylight hours. Strange riders appeared on distant ridges, watching the ranch for hours before disappearing. Neighbors stopped visiting, and the usual friendly exchanges at the local trading post became tense and suspicious. The situation escalated when Jack's neighbor, Tom Bradley, arrived at the ranch with disturbing news. Bradley was a decent man who had always maintained good relations with Jack's family, but now he looked nervous and uncomfortable. He reported that Captain Hayes had been asking questions about Jack throughout the community. The captain was particularly interested in Jack's nighttime activities and his knowledge of Apache customs. Bradley also brought word that the territorial governor had issued new orders regarding Apache sympathizers. Anyone suspected of providing aid to hostile Indians could now be arrested without formal charges and held indefinitely for investigation. Property belonging to suspected sympathizers could be confiscated to prevent it from being used to support enemy activities. This news forced Jack to confront a terrible reality. His efforts to help the Apache refugees had not gone unnoticed, and it was only a matter of time before Captain Hayes gathered enough evidence to take action against him. The safety of his wife and children now depended on decisions he made in the next few days. That evening, Jack had a difficult conversation with Sarah about their situation. He explained his involvement with the Apache refugees without revealing the specific details that might endanger her if she were questioned by authorities. Sarah listened to her husband's account with growing alarm, but she did not express anger or criticism of his choices. Instead, Sarah surprised Jack with her response. She told him that she had suspected he was involved in something dangerous, and she had been preparing for the possibility that they might need to leave their ranch quickly. She had quietly gathered important documents, family photographs, and portable valuables. She had also made arrangements for Emma and Thomas to stay with her sister in town if necessary. Sarah's practical preparations revealed the strength and wisdom that had made her an ideal partner for life in the harsh territory. She understood that Jack's conscience had compelled him to help people in desperate need, and she supported his decision even though it threatened everything they had worked to build. The next morning brought the crisis Jack had been dreading. Captain Hayes arrived at the ranch with a full company of soldiers, not just the small militia unit he had brought for his previous search. This time, Hayes carried official arrest warrants and confiscation orders signed by the territorial judge. Jack was being charged with providing material support to enemy combatants. Hayes announced that Jack would be taken to the territorial prison to await trial, and that the ranch would be placed under military control pending the outcome of legal proceedings. Sarah and the children would be allowed to remain in the house temporarily, but they would be under constant surveillance. Any attempt to communicate with Apache forces would result in additional charges. As soldiers placed Jack in shackles, he caught sight of movement on the ridges surrounding his ranch. Apache warriors were positioned among the rocks watching the arrest proceedings. Jack realized that Nietzsche and his followers were witnessing the consequences of their friendship with a white rancher. The knowledge that his Apache allies were nearby provided some comfort, but it also increased his concern for his family's safety. The journey to the territorial prison took 2 days through some of the most dangerous territory in Arizona. Captain Hayes deliberately chose a route that would take them through areas known for Apache activity, hoping to provoke an attack that would provide additional evidence of Jack's collaboration with hostile Indians. Hayes made it clear that he expected Jack's Apache friends to attempt a rescue, and that any such attempt would result in Jack being shot while trying to escape. During the long ride, Jack had time to consider his situation and plan for whatever might come next. He knew that a trial would be largely a formality, since territorial judges were under pressure to convict anyone accused of supporting Apache resistance. His only hope lay in finding a way to prove that his actions had been motivated by humanitarian concerns rather than political sympathy for Apache causes. On the second day of travel, Hayes's expectations were fulfilled in a way that no one anticipated. As the military convoy passed through a narrow canyon, Apache warriors appeared on the cliffs above, but instead of attacking, they called out in their own language, requesting a meeting under a flag of truce. Captain Hayes initially refused, but changed his mind when he realized that capturing additional Apache leaders could enhance his military reputation. Naich himself descended from the cliffs, accompanied by 2 other senior warriors. He approached the military convoy with the dignity and bearing of a leader representing his people in formal negotiations. Hayes agreed to hear what the Apache leader had to say, but warned that any treachery would result in immediate violence. Naich spoke in English, demonstrating his own intelligence and diplomatic skills. He told Captain Hayes that he had come to make an offer that could benefit both Apache and white communities. Naich proposed a prisoner exchange that would resolve multiple conflicts simultaneously while demonstrating the possibility of peaceful cooperation between the two peoples. That the Apache leader's proposal was both simple and profound. In exchange for Jack's freedom, Naich would provide information about the location of a large cache of weapons that had been stolen from a military supply train several months earlier. These weapons were being held by a renegade Apache band that was operating independently of the main tribal leadership, and their activities were causing problems for both white settlers and peaceful Apache communities. More importantly, Naich offered to arrange a meeting between territorial authorities and moderate Apache leaders who were interested in negotiating a peaceful resolution to the ongoing conflict. Such a meeting could potentially end years of violence and create a framework for coexistence that would benefit everyone in the territory. Captain Hayes was initially skeptical of this proposal, suspecting that it was simply a trick to free Jack without providing any real benefit to the territorial government. But Naich sweetened the offer by providing immediately verifiable information about recent Apache raids that Hayes could use to enhance his own standing with superior officers. The Apache leader also made a personal appeal that surprised everyone present. He told Hayes that Jack Morrison was the first white man he had ever met who treated Apache people with genuine respect and dignity. Naich argued that such individuals were rare and valuable, and that their contributions to peace were far more important than any symbolic value that might come from punishing them. During these negotiations, Jack remained silent, understanding that his fate was being decided by forces much larger than his individual circumstances. He watched the interaction between Naich and Captain Hayes with fascination, seeing 2 strong leaders from different cultures attempting to find common ground despite years of mutual hostility. After several hours of discussion, Captain Hayes agreed to consider Naich's proposal, but with strict conditions. The information about the weapon cache would have to be verified before any prisoner exchange could take place. Additionally, Naich would have to provide guarantees that Jack would not be involved in any future activities that could be interpreted as support for Apache resistance. Naich accepted these conditions, but he also made demands of his own. He insisted that any future peace negotiations must include representation from all Apache bands, not just those groups that the territorial government found convenient to deal with. He also demanded that traditional Apache access to sacred sites be protected in any long-term agreement. The temporary camp where the negotiations took place became an unlikely meeting ground between 2 worlds that had known only conflict for generations. Captain Hayes established a military perimeter, while Naich's warriors maintained their positions on the surrounding ridges. In the center, beneath a makeshift tent, Jack found himself at the heart of discussions that could reshape the future of the territory. Over the next 3 days, the weapon cache information proved to be accurate. Hayes dispatched a small unit to investigate Naich's intelligence, and they returned with confirmation that a significant arsenal had indeed been recovered from the location described by the Apache leader. The weapons included military rifles, ammunition, and even a small cannon that had been taken during the supply train raid. This success convinced Hayes that Naich was negotiating in good faith, but it also revealed the complexity of the situation facing all parties involved. The renegade Apache band that had been hoarding the weapons was led by a warrior named Victorio, who rejected any possibility of peace with white settlers. Victorio's followers believed that total war was the only path to preserving Apache independence, and they viewed leaders like Naich as traitors to their people. The recovery of the weapons cache also had an unexpected consequence. Among the items found was a diary kept by one of the soldiers killed during the original supply train raid. The diary contained detailed accounts of military atrocities committed against Apache communities, including the deliberate targeting of women and children during so-called military operations. When Captain Hayes read portions of this diary, he was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the conduct of some territorial forces. The dead soldier had written about orders to show no mercy to Apache people, regardless of their age or involvement in hostilities. These revelations helped Hayes understand why Apache resistance had been so fierce, and why leaders like Naiche had found it difficult to trust white authorities. During the negotiations, Jack served as an unofficial translator and cultural interpreter, helping both sides understand each other's perspectives and concerns. His unique position as a white man trusted by Apache leaders made him valuable to the peace process. But it also made him a target for extremists on both sides, who opposed any form of cooperation. As the discussions progressed, a larger framework for peace began to emerge. Naiche proposed the establishment of a series of protected zones where Apache families could live, according to their traditional ways, while maintaining peaceful relations with white settlers. In exchange, Apache leaders would guarantee safe passage for travelers and traders through traditional Apache territories. The proposal also included provisions for joint patrols that would include both territorial forces and Apache warriors. These mixed units would be responsible for tracking down renegade bands like Victorio's group, which threatened the safety of both Apache and white communities. Such cooperation would require unprecedented trust between former enemies, but both Naiche and Hayes began to see the practical benefits of working together. Captain Hayes found himself in a difficult position as these negotiations developed. His military superiors expected him to capture or kill Apache leaders, not negotiate peace agreements with them. But the intelligence and cooperation provided by Naiche had already resulted in significant tactical victories that enhanced Hayes's reputation. The captain began to realize that success in ending the Apache conflicts could advance his career more than continued warfare. On the fourth day of negotiations, the discussions were interrupted by news that threatened to destroy any hope of peace. A messenger arrived with reports that Victorio's renegade band had attacked a small settlement near the Mexican border. 7 settlers had been killed, including 2 children, and several buildings had been burned. The attack had been particularly brutal, with evidence suggesting that the victims had been tortured before being killed. This news created an immediate crisis for the peace negotiations. Territorial authorities would be under tremendous pressure to respond with massive military force against all Apache people, regardless of their involvement in the attack. Public opinion would demand revenge, and politicians would find it difficult to support any agreement that appeared to reward Apache violence. Naiche understood the implications of Victorio's attack better than anyone. He knew that the actions of the renegade band could destroy years of careful diplomacy and lead to a war of extermination against all Apache people. The attack had been timed deliberately to sabotage the peace negotiations, and Victorio had achieved exactly the result he wanted. In response to this crisis, Naiche made an extraordinary offer that shocked both Captain Hayes and Jack. The Apache leader proposed to personally lead a joint military expedition to track down and capture Victorio's band. Naiche would provide Apache scouts and warriors to assist territorial forces in locating the renegades, and he would use his authority as a tribal leader to demand Victorio's surrender. This proposal represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between Apache and territorial forces. Never before had an Apache leader offered to actively participate in military operations against other Apache warriors. Naiche's willingness to take such action demonstrated his commitment to peace, but it also placed him in extreme personal danger from Apache extremists, who would view his actions as the ultimate betrayal. Captain Hayes realized that accepting Naiche's offer could provide the territorial government with its best opportunity to end the Apache conflicts once and for all. Joint operations would be far more effective than purely military approaches, since Apache scouts could track renegade bands through terrain that was nearly impossible for conventional forces to navigate. However, the captain also understood the political risks involved in such cooperation. If the joint expedition failed or if it resulted in significant casualties among territorial forces, Hayes would be held responsible for trusting Apache allies. His military career and possibly his life would depend on the success of a new alliance with people who had been defined as enemies for decades. Jack found himself playing an increasingly important role as these momentous decisions were being made. Both Nietzsche and Captain Hayes trusted his judgment and relied on his cultural knowledge to navigate the complex negotiations. Jack realized that his friendship with the Apache people had evolved into something far greater than he had ever imagined when he first offered shelter to Nietzsche and his warriors. The discussions surrounding the joint expedition also revealed the personal courage required from all participants. Nietzsche would be risking his standing within Apache society, and possibly his life by leading military action against fellow Apache warriors. Captain Hayes would be risking his military career by trusting former enemies with the lives of his soldiers. Jack would be risking his family's safety by serving as a liaison between the two groups. As the negotiations continued, it became clear that the success or failure of the joint expedition would determine not only the immediate fate of the participants, but also the long-term future of relationships between Apache and white communities throughout the territory. The mission would serve as a test of whether cooperation and mutual respect could overcome generations of mistrust and violence. The weight of these responsibilities was enormous, but all three men understood that they had reached a historic moment when individual choices could change the course of history. The prophecy that Delche had shared with Jack began to seem less like mystical speculation and more like an accurate prediction of the crisis that was now unfolding on Moor. The evening before the final decision about the joint expedition, Jack sat alone under the desert stars, contemplating the journey that had brought him to this point. His simple act of compassion toward three desperate Apache warriors had set in motion events that could reshape the entire territory. The quiet rancher who had only wanted to live peacefully with his family had become a central figure in negotiations that could determine whether future generations would know peace or continued warfare. The joint expedition departed at dawn on a crisp October morning, with 40 territorial soldiers riding alongside 30 Apache warriors under the combined leadership of Captain Hayes and Nietzsche. Jack rode between the two groups, serving as translator and mediator for what was perhaps the most unusual military operation in the history of the Arizona Territory. The atmosphere during the first day of travel was tense and uncertain. Many of the soldiers had spent years fighting Apache warriors, and they found it difficult to accept their former enemies as allies. Similarly, the Apache warriors were suspicious of working with soldiers who had been responsible for attacks on their people. Only the shared respect for their leaders and the common goal of stopping Victorio's violent rampage kept the expedition together. Jack's role as cultural interpreter became crucial during the early stages of the mission. He helped resolve misunderstandings about camping procedures, water rights, and military protocols that could have escalated into serious conflicts. His ability to communicate in both languages and his understanding of both cultures made him indispensable to the success of the joint operation. The expedition's first major challenge came when they reached the rough terrain near the Mexican border where Victorio's band was believed to be hiding. The area consisted of deep canyons, hidden valleys, and maze-like rock formations that provided countless opportunities for ambush. Traditional military tactics would be useless in such terrain, and the expedition would have to rely heavily on Apache scouting skills and local knowledge. Nietzsche divided his warriors into small tracking teams that could move quietly through the difficult landscape while maintaining communication with the main force. These Apache scouts were able to locate signs of Victorio's passage that would have been invisible to conventional military trackers. Within 2 days, they had identified 3 possible locations where the renegade band might be established. The intelligence gathered by the Apache scouts revealed that Victorio's band was larger and better organized than anyone had expected. The renegade leader had apparently been recruiting warriors from various Apache groups who were opposed to any form of peace with white settlers. His force now included nearly 60 fighters, many of whom were experienced warriors with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. More disturbing was the discovery that Victorio had been in contact with hostile Mexican groups who were providing him with weapons and supplies in exchange for his agreement to raid American settlements along the border. This international dimension of the conflict meant that the joint expedition was not just pursuing Apache renegades, but was also confronting a cross-border alliance that threatened the security of the entire region. Captain Hayes realized that his small force would be inadequate for a direct assault on Victorio's stronghold. However, Nietzsche proposed an alternative strategy that could achieve their objectives without a costly frontal attack. The Apache leader suggested that they use traditional Apache tactics of stealth and psychological warfare to force Victorio into a disadvantageous position. The plan developed by Nietzsche was both clever and dangerous. Small teams of Apache warriors would infiltrate the area around Victorio's camp during the night, creating the impression that they were surrounded by a much larger force than actually existed. Meanwhile, Nietzsche himself would approach Victorio under a flag of truce and attempt to convince him to surrender, by arguing that continued resistance was hopeless. Jack volunteered to accompany Nietzsche during the surrender negotiations, believing that his presence as a white witness might provide additional credibility to any agreement that was reached. Captain Hayes was initially reluctant to risk a civilian in such a dangerous mission, but he eventually agreed when he realized that Jack's involvement might help convince Victorio that the territorial government was genuinely committed to peaceful resolution of conflicts. The night infiltration proceeded according to plan, with Apache scouts successfully positioning themselves around Victorio's stronghold without being detected. As dawn broke, the renegade band found themselves facing evidence of a significant military presence. Although they could not determine the exact size or composition of the force arrayed against them, when Nietzsche and Jack approached the renegade camp under a white flag, they were met by Victorio himself, along with several of his most trusted lieutenants. Victorio was a man in his 40s with the bearing of a natural leader and the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much violence. His initial reaction to seeing Jack was one of contempt and suspicion, since he viewed any cooperation between Apache and white people as betrayal of Apache values. The negotiations that followed were among the most intense and difficult conversations that Jack had ever experienced. Victorio argued passionately that Apache people could never find justice or safety by trusting white authorities, pointing to decades of broken treaties and military atrocities as evidence for his position. He viewed Nietzsche's cooperation with territorial forces as naive and ultimately suicidal for the Apache people. Nietzsche responded with equal passion, arguing that continued warfare would lead only to the complete destruction of Apache communities. He pointed out that Apache people were vastly outnumbered by white settlers and soldiers, and that military technology was making traditional Apache tactics increasingly ineffective. The only hope for Apache survival, according to Nietzsche, lay in negotiating agreements that would protect Apache rights while ending the cycle of violence. Jack listened to this debate with growing understanding of the tragic choices facing Apache leaders. Both men were motivated by genuine concern for their people's welfare, but they had reached completely different conclusions about the best path forward. Victorio's position was based on pride and a refusal to accept defeat, while Nietzsche's approach was based on pragmatic acceptance of changing circumstances. As the negotiations continued, it became clear that Victorio would not agree to surrender without significant concessions from the territorial government. The renegade leader demanded amnesty for all members of his band, guaranteed access to traditional Apache hunting grounds, and compensation for Apache lands that had been taken by white settlers. These demands went far beyond what Captain Hayes had authority to negotiate. The deadlock was broken by an unexpected development. One of Victorio's own lieutenants, a younger warrior named Cochise after the famous leader, began to express doubts about the wisdom of continued resistance. This young warrior had witnessed the recent attack on the settlement and was troubled by the killing of innocent civilians, including children. Cochise spoke directly to Victorio in front of the assembled warriors, challenging his leader's tactics and questioning whether such violence truly served Apache interests. The young warrior argued that the brutal attack on the settlement had turned potential sympathizers against Apache people and had made peaceful coexistence much more difficult to achieve. This internal challenge to Victorio's leadership created a crisis within the renegade band. Several other warriors began to voice their own concerns about the direction of their resistance movement. Some were weary of constant warfare and wanted to return to their families. Others were concerned about the alliance with Mexican groups, which they viewed as a betrayal of Apache independence. Jack realized that this moment of internal discord might provide the key to resolving the standoff peacefully. He asked Nietzsche for permission to address the assembled Apache warriors directly, hoping that his unique perspective as a white man, who had risked everything to help Apache people, might carry special weight in their deliberations. Speaking in Apache, Jack told the warriors about his experiences with their people and his growing understanding of their struggles. He acknowledged the injustices that Apache communities had suffered and expressed his respect for their courage in defending their way of life. But he also shared his belief that continued violence would ultimately destroy everything they were trying to protect. Jack's speech had a profound impact on the assembled warriors because it came from someone who had demonstrated his commitment to Apache welfare through actions rather than words. His willingness to risk his own family's safety to help Apache refugees proved that cooperation between Apache and white people was possible, even if it was rare and difficult. The turning point came when Jack made a personal pledge that surprised everyone present. He promised that if Victorio's band agreed to surrender, he would use his influence with territorial authorities to ensure that they were treated fairly and that their concerns about Apache rights would be seriously addressed in future negotiations. More importantly, Jack offered to serve as a permanent liaison between Apache communities and territorial government, working to prevent the misunderstandings and broken promises that had fueled so much conflict in the past. His proposal represented a new model for Apache-white relations based on mutual respect and ongoing dialogue rather than military domination. Victoria was clearly moved by Jack's offer, but he remained skeptical about the territorial government's willingness to honor any agreements that might be reached. The renegade leader had seen too many treaties broken and too many promises forgotten to trust in the good intentions of white officials. However, the dissension within his own ranks was growing stronger, and Victorio realized that his authority was being challenged by warriors who were no longer convinced that total warfare was the only option. The young warrior Cochise had become a focal point for those who wanted to explore peaceful alternatives, and his influence was spreading rapidly through the band. After hours of intense discussion among the Apache warriors, a compromise proposal emerged that offered hope for resolving the crisis. Victorio would agree to surrender on the condition that the territorial government would grant amnesty to all members of his band and would begin immediate negotiations for a comprehensive peace agreement that would address Apache concerns about land, rights, and cultural preservation. Captain Hayes found himself in an extremely difficult position when this proposal was presented to him. He lacked the authority to make such significant commitments on behalf of the territorial government, but he also understood that this might be the only opportunity to end the Apache conflicts without massive bloodshed. After considerable deliberation, Hayes decided to accept the proposal with the understanding that it would require ratification by higher authorities. He sent riders back to territorial headquarters with urgent requests for expanded negotiating authority and instructions from the governor about how to proceed with the unprecedented peace initiative. While waiting for responses from territorial authorities, the joint expedition established a temporary camp where Apache and white forces maintained an uneasy truce. This period of waiting provided an opportunity for members of both groups to interact on a personal level for the first time in years. Jack facilitated many of these interactions, serving as translator and cultural guide for soldiers and warriors who were curious about each other's backgrounds and motivations. These conversations revealed that individuals on both sides shared common concerns about family, survival, and the desire for a peaceful future. The most significant development during this waiting period was the friendship that developed between Captain Hayes and the young Apache warrior Cochise. Despite their different backgrounds and the history of conflict between their peoples, the two men discovered that they shared similar leadership challenges and military philosophies. This personal connection between Hayes and Cochise became a model for the kind of relationships that would be necessary for long-term peace in the territory. Both men were respected by their followers, and their willingness to work together demonstrated that cooperation was possible even between former enemies. The response from territorial headquarters arrived 5 days later, carried by a messenger who had ridden hard through dangerous country to deliver the governor's decision. Captain Hayes opened the sealed orders with considerable anxiety, knowing that the contents would determine whether the fragile peace negotiations could continue or whether the situation would deteriorate into renewed warfare. The territorial governor's instructions were both encouraging and challenging. He authorized Captain Hayes to negotiate a preliminary surrender agreement with Victorio's band, but with strict conditions that would test the commitment of all parties involved. The Apache warriors would be required to surrender their weapons and submit to temporary custody, while territorial authorities conducted investigations into specific criminal acts. More significantly, the governor demanded that Apache leaders provide detailed information about the locations of other hostile bands operating in the territory. This intelligence would be used to launch additional military operations designed to eliminate all sources of Apache resistance within the next 6 months. When Captain Hayes shared these conditions with Nietzsche and Jack, both men immediately understood the political pressures that had shaped the governor's response. Territorial authorities were under tremendous pressure from settlers and business interests to end the Apache conflicts decisively. Any peace agreement that appeared to reward Apache resistance would be politically unacceptable to white voters. However, the governor's conditions also contained elements that could provide a foundation for genuine peace if they were implemented with wisdom and restraint. The requirement for temporary custody could be structured to protect Apache prisoners from vigilante violence, while ensuring that they received fair treatment under territorial law. The intelligence sharing could be limited to information about genuinely hostile groups rather than all Apache communities. Nietzsche faced an agonizing decision as he considered the governor's terms. Agreeing to provide information about other Apache bands would be seen by many of his people as an act of betrayal that violated traditional concepts of tribal loyalty. But refusing to cooperate would almost certainly result in renewed military campaigns that could destroy Apache communities throughout the territory. The debate within the Apache camp was intense and sometimes angry as warriors struggled with questions that had no easy answers. Some argued that any cooperation with territorial authorities would ultimately lead to the destruction of Apache independence and culture. Others contended that strategic cooperation might be the only way to preserve some degree of Apache autonomy in a rapidly changing world. Jack found himself serving as an informal counselor to Apache leaders who were wrestling with these impossible choices. His unique position as a white man trusted by Apache people allowed him to provide perspectives that might not be accepted from other sources. He helped Apache leaders understand the political realities facing territorial authorities while also advocating for Apache concerns in his discussions with Captain Hayes. The breakthrough came when the young warrior Cochise proposed a modified approach that might satisfy both Apache and territorial concerns. Instead of providing comprehensive intelligence about all Apache bands, Nietzsche would share information only about groups that were actively engaged in attacks on civilian settlements. This distinction would allow Apache leaders to maintain their integrity while still demonstrating their commitment to ending violence against innocent people. Cochise also suggested that the temporary custody requirement could be structured as a form of protective supervision rather than imprisonment. Apache prisoners would be housed in a special camp near the territorial capital, where they could maintain their cultural practices while demonstrating their peaceful intentions to white authorities. Family members would be allowed to visit, and Apache leaders would participate in the administration of the camp. These proposals represented a creative compromise that addressed the core concerns of all parties while avoiding the most problematic aspects of the governor's original conditions. Captain Hayes recognized the wisdom of Cochise's suggestions and agreed to present them to territorial authorities as amendments to the preliminary surrender agreement. While waiting for approval of these modifications, an unexpected crisis threatened to destroy all the progress that had been made toward peace. A group of white vigilantes, angry about recent Apache raids and opposed to any negotiated settlement, launched an attack on a peaceful Apache village about 50 miles from the negotiation site. The vigilante attack was particularly brutal, resulting in the deaths of 12 Apache civilians, including women and children who had played no role in any hostile activities. The attackers justified their actions by claiming that all Apache people were responsible for the crimes of hostile bands, and that negotiating with Apache leaders was equivalent to surrendering to terrorism. News of the vigilante attack reached the negotiation camp within hours, carried by Apache messengers who had witnessed the violence. The reaction among Victorio's warriors was immediate and intense, with many calling for an end to all peace negotiations and a return to total warfare against white settlers. Victorio himself was torn between his growing conviction that peace might be possible and his anger over the latest atrocity committed against his people. The vigilante attack seemed to confirm his original belief that white people could never be trusted to honor agreements or protect innocent Apache lives. Jack realized that the vigilante attack represented the greatest threat to peace that the negotiation process had yet faced. Unless the territorial government took immediate and decisive action to demonstrate its commitment to protecting peaceful Apache communities, the fragile trust that had been built over the previous weeks would be completely destroyed. Working with Captain Hayes, Jack developed a proposal that might salvage the peace negotiations despite the crisis created by the vigilante attack. He suggested that territorial authorities should immediately arrest and prosecute the vigilantes responsible for the attack on the peaceful Apache village. This action would demonstrate that the territorial government was committed to protecting all residents of the territory, regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. Additionally, Jack proposed that territorial authorities should provide compensation to the families of the Apache victims and should establish a formal mechanism for investigating and prosecuting crimes committed by white settlers against Apache people. Such measures would show that the territorial government was serious about creating a system of justice that applied equally to all residents. Captain Hayes was initially reluctant to make such commitments, knowing that they would be extremely unpopular with white settlers who viewed Apache people as enemies rather than fellow residents of the territory. However, he also understood that without some dramatic gesture of good faith, the peace negotiations would collapse and the territory would face years of continued warfare. The captain's decision to support Jack's proposals represented a significant evolution in his own thinking about the Apache conflicts. Hayes had begun the expedition as a conventional military officer, focused primarily on defeating enemy forces. But his experiences working with Nietzsche and observing the courage and wisdom of Apache leaders had changed his perspective on the nature of the conflict and the possibilities for resolution. When Hayes presented Jack's proposals to Nietzsche and Victorio, the Apache leaders were surprised by the scope of the commitments being offered. Never before had white authorities suggested that they would prosecute white civilians for crimes against Apache people or provide compensation for Apache losses. The proposals also addressed one of the fundamental issues that had made previous peace negotiations unsuccessful. Apache leaders had always insisted that any lasting peace would require white authorities to demonstrate their commitment to justice and equality under the law. Jack's suggestions provided a concrete framework for implementing such principles. However, implementing these proposals would require unprecedented cooperation between territorial authorities, military commanders, and civilian law enforcement agencies. The success of the peace initiative would depend not only on the willingness of Apache leaders to honor their commitments, but also on the ability of white authorities to control extremist elements within their own communities. The final phase of the peace negotiations took place in the territorial capital, where representatives from all parties gathered to formalize the agreements that had been developed during the field negotiations. Jack found himself in the unprecedented position of serving as an official advisor to both Apache leaders and territorial authorities, a role that reflected the trust he had earned from both sides. The signing ceremony was held in the governor's mansion, with Apache chiefs seated alongside territorial officials in a display of equality that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Nietzsche wore traditional Apache ceremonial dress, while Victorio appeared in a combination of Apache and American clothing that symbolized his acceptance of a new relationship between the two peoples. Governor Richardson, a practical politician who had initially been skeptical of the peace initiative, delivered remarks that acknowledged the historic nature of the agreements being signed. He praised the courage of all participants and expressed his hope that the accords would serve as a model for resolving conflicts between different communities throughout the American West. The final agreements included several groundbreaking provisions that established new standards for relationships between Native American tribes and territorial governments. Apache communities would be granted guaranteed access to traditional hunting and gathering areas, with specific protections for sacred sites that were important to Apache religious practices. More importantly, The agreements established a joint council that would include both Apache and white representatives, with authority to resolve disputes and oversee the implementation of the peace accords. This council would have the power to investigate complaints from either community and to recommend changes in territorial policies that affected Apache people. The agreements also created a new law enforcement structure that included Apache officers with authority to investigate crimes involving Apache victims. This provision addressed one of the fundamental sources of conflict by ensuring that Apache people would have legal recourse when they were victimized by white criminals. Captain Hayes was promoted to the rank of major and given command of a new territorial unit specifically designed to work with Apache allies in maintaining peace throughout the region. The young Apache warrior Cochise was appointed as his deputy, creating an unprecedented partnership that symbolized the spirit of cooperation embodied in the peace accords. Jack's role in the new arrangements was perhaps the most unique of all. He was appointed as the first director of Indian Affairs for the territory, with responsibility for overseeing the implementation of the peace agreements and serving as a liaison between Apache communities and territorial government. His ranch would serve as a neutral meeting place where representatives from both communities could gather to resolve problems before they escalated into serious conflicts. The immediate results of the peace accords exceeded everyone's expectations. Apache raids on settler communities ceased entirely, while territorial forces redirected their efforts toward combating Mexican bandits and other criminal groups that threatened the security of all residents. Trade between Apache and white communities flourished, with Apache craftspeople and hunters finding ready markets for their goods in territorial settlements. More significantly, the success of the Arizona Peace Accords attracted national attention and inspired similar initiatives in other territories where conflicts between Native American tribes and white settlers had seemed intractable. Jack found himself consulting with government officials and tribal leaders from throughout the West who wanted to understand how such different peoples had found ways to coexist peacefully. The personal transformations experienced by the key participants were as remarkable as the political changes they had helped to create. Naiche became a respected statesman who traveled throughout the country advocating for Native American rights and peaceful resolution of conflicts. His speeches at universities and government meetings helped educate white Americans about Apache culture and challenged stereotypes that had fueled decades of warfare. Victorio, who had once been the most feared Apache war leader in the territory, became an advocate for education and cultural preservation. He established schools where Apache children could learn both traditional knowledge and the skills they would need to succeed in an increasingly interconnected world. His transformation from warrior to educator demonstrated the possibility of channeling warrior values into constructive rather than destructive activities. Captain Hayes, now Major Hayes, developed new military doctrines that emphasized cooperation with local populations rather than domination through force. His innovations in cross-cultural military cooperation influenced American military thinking for generations and helped establish principles that would later prove valuable in international peacekeeping operations. The young warrior Cochise became a bridge between generations of Apache people, helping older leaders adapt to changing circumstances while ensuring that younger Apache people maintained connections to their cultural heritage. His partnership with Major Hayes proved that former enemies could become trusted allies when they shared common goals and mutual respect. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in Jack Morrison himself. The quiet rancher who had simply wanted to live peacefully with his family discovered that his willingness to treat all people with dignity and respect had given him a unique role in shaping the future of his region. His experiences taught him that individual acts of courage and compassion could have consequences far beyond anything that might be imagined at the time. The prophecy that the old medicine man Delche had shared with Jack during their brief encounter proved to be remarkably accurate. The great crisis that threatened both Apache and white communities had indeed required cooperation between representatives of both peoples. Jack's willingness to risk everything for his principles had made him the white man destiny, had chosen to help prevent a tragedy that could have cost thousands of lives. 10 years after the signing of the peace accords, Jack stood on the porch of his ranch house watching his children play with Apache friends in the yard below. The sight would have been impossible to imagine during the dark days when warfare seemed to be the only relationship possible between Apache and white people. Sarah joined her husband on the porch, sharing the quiet satisfaction of people who had witnessed historic changes in their own community. Their ranch had indeed become a neutral meeting place, where people from different backgrounds could come together to solve problems and build understanding. The guest book in their living room contained signatures from Apache chiefs, territorial officials, visiting dignitaries, and ordinary families who had traveled great distances to see how former enemies had learned to live together in peace. The success of the Arizona Peace Accords proved that even the most bitter conflicts could be resolved when individuals were willing to risk everything for their principles and when leaders on all sides were committed to finding solutions rather than achieving total victory. The story of Apache Tall and his friendship with Apache leaders became a legend that inspired future generations to believe that understanding and cooperation between different peoples was always possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. The ranch that had once been a simple cattle operation became a symbol of hope that attracted visitors from around the world. Scholars, diplomats, and peace activists came to study the methods that had been used to transform a region torn by warfare into a model of intercultural cooperation and mutual respect. Jack Morrison never sought fame or recognition for his role in these historic events. He remained a rancher at heart, finding satisfaction in the simple rhythms of rural life and the knowledge that his family could live in safety and peace. But he also understood that his experiences had given him responsibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of his own property. In his later years, Jack often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with his decision to offer shelter to 3 desperate Apache warriors. That single act of compassion had set in motion changes that transformed an entire territory and provided hope for peaceful resolution of conflicts around the world. The lesson he drew from these experiences was simple but profound. Individual choices matter, and ordinary people can change the course of history when they have the courage to follow their conscience regardless of the personal cost.